Episode 1. The Birth of the Empire, Humanity's New Dawn, 2546.
To understand the birth of the empire, we must first understand the age that made it necessary, or at least the age that made it possible. Humanity, at the dawn of the 26th century, was a species intoxicated by its own success. Technological innovation had outpaced governance, expansion had outpaced wisdom, and ambition had outpaced stability. Across more than a dozen systems, humanity thrived, yet it did so chaotically. On Terra, the megacity of Prime glittered like a jewel of civilization. On Earth, Shanghai rose in breathtaking neon spires, its skylines humming with industry and pride. But far from those shining core, long before the Tevarin returned to challenge humanity, the united planets of Earth had already begun to fail the very people it claimed to protect. The cracks appeared slowly at first, like fractures beneath the surface of a great monument. But with time, they widened, and what began as minor strains grew into deep structural fault lines. In the prosperous core worlds, places like Earth and Terra, life moved forward with glittering confidence. Megacities hummed with industry, culture blossomed, and the wealthy grew wealthier. But beyond that shining core, out along the frontier, the story was very different. Colonies at the edge of human space became deeply dependent on mega corporations. ArcCorp, Lamberdun, Cis Lunar Holdings, names that would one day dominate entire industries, built vast manufacturing and mining empires by exploiting distant worlds. Workers on planets like Magnus and Van lived hard, dangerous lives. Strikes were common and often ended in violence. When help was requested from the UPE, it almost never came, not because of cruelty, but because the tribunal simply could not agree on what action to take. As the economy destabilized on the frontier, another threat grew in the shadows. Piracy groups like the early Nine Tails carved out territories where UPE law held no sway at all. Some systems lived under the rule of smugglers, raiders, and local warlords, not elected representatives. And while crime grew, so did something more subtle, but far more dangerous: cultural fragmentation. Different planets began to develop their own identity, their own traditions, their own political ideologies. Families living on Terra increasingly felt less like citizens of a unified humanity, and more like beings of Terra first and humanity second. The dream of a single civilization was dissolving. Humanity was no longer one people. It was merely one species, divided, drifting, and vulnerable.
Chapter 2. The War That Broke the Silence, 2541 to 2546.
History rarely shatters in an instant, but when it does, the sound carries for centuries. In 2541, humanity heard such a sound. Without warning, through a jump point, long thought dead, a fleet emerged, sleek, dark, and disciplined. The Tevarin had returned, not as wanderers, not as diplomats, but as warriors reclaiming what they believed was rightfully theirs. The UPE was unprepared, not militarily, but psychologically. For the first time in generations, humanity felt vulnerable, and the galaxy held its breath. The first months of the war were nothing short of catastrophic. 3 frontier garrisons fell in the opening weeks. Trade hubs collapsed into fire. Orbital cities evacuated in blind panic. Entire settlements vanished beneath coordinated Tevarin strikes. Their shield technology, the legendary phalanx, rendered UPE weapons frustratingly ineffective. Shots that should have torn ships apart splashed harmlessly across shimmering teal barriers. Analysts of the era described the opening year as a catastrophe unfolding in slow motion. The public called it something simpler: terror. The UPE leadership attempted to respond. They called emergency sessions, declared urgent interventions, drafted action plans. But no plan survived the tribunal. The High Secretary pushed for diplomacy. The High Advocate demanded retreat and consolidation. The High General insisted on total mobilization. 3 leaders, 3 visions, 3 vetoes. In the time they spent arguing, another colony fell, and another, and another. The people didn't see the debates. They only saw the consequences. Humanity was losing. Amid the chaos, one name began to circulate through dispatches, military reports, and desperate late-night broadcasts: Ivar Messer. Not because he was the highest-ranking commander, not because he had the most ships, but because he did something that no one else seemed able to do. He won. His tactics were ruthless, precise, and terrifyingly efficient. He pushed his soldiers hard, sometimes too hard, but he always produced results. And in a war that felt like an endless series of failures, results were salvation. By 2545, Messer was no longer simply a rising officer. He had become something larger, a symbol of hope, and of what humanity believed it could still be. The war reached its boiling point on a world that would forever be burned into the collective memory of humanity. Idris IV. The battle was a storm of contradictions, violent, beautiful, chaotic, orchestrated. In the skies, hundreds of ships clashed in shimmering spirals of fire. On the ground, infantry fought through sulfur storms, acid rain, and electromagnetic tempests created by failing weather control satellites. Orbital defenses flickered. Evacuation corridors collapsed. Civilians fled through streets that disintegrated beneath bombardments. It was hell, real, unfiltered hell, and it was here that Messer made his final move, not with superior firepower, but with superior psychology. He dismantled the Tevarin's confidence, turned their formations against them, forced them into a retreat that felt less like defeat and more like inevitability. On March 12, 2546, the Tevarin lines broke. The war was over. Humanity had survived, and Ivar Messer's ascent had become unstoppable. War does not create heroes. People do. And when a civilization is afraid, when it is wounded and desperate, it will gladly place its future into the hands of the one person who promises victory. Messer promised more than that. He promised order, and the galaxy was ready to follow him anywhere.
Chapter 3: The Hero Who Became a Ruler.
The war had ended. Humanity stood battered, but victorious. And in the ruins of the conflict, one name echoed louder than all the others: Ivar Messer. To the public, he was the commander who had saved worlds. To the military, he was the strategist who had dismantled an enemy they once believed unbeatable. To the leaders of the UPE, he was a problem. For the tribunal, Messer represented something dangerous, a man who held the loyalty of the people far more tightly than they did, and they were right to be afraid. In the months following the war, the UPE struggled to reassert control. Worlds ravaged by conflict demanded reconstruction. Frontier outposts begged for protection. Economic collapses threatened to tear entire systems apart. But the tribunal was the same fractured institution that had failed before the war. People no longer believed in it. They believed in Messer. He filled the void the government could not. His speeches were direct, measured, and unmistakably confident. He spoke of unity, strength, and the promise of a future in which humanity would never again be caught unprepared. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he became the voice the public turned to for leadership. Messer did not seize power. He didn't need to. All he had to do was stand still and let the people walk toward him. Every crisis, every protest, every failure of the tribunal pushed the public closer. He presented himself as the calm center of the storm, the figure who had proven himself through action, not debate. He spoke often of the dangers still lurking beyond the borders of human space, of the need for unity, of never again falling into weakness. Fear did the rest. By the end of 2546, the inevitable could no longer be delayed. Under mounting pressure from both the public and the military, the tribunal transferred full executive authority to Ivar Messer. Officially, it was not a coup. There were no soldiers in the streets, no barricades, no show of force. It was a legal transition, a peaceful realignment, a necessary restructuring. But historians would later agree it was one of the cleanest political takeovers in human history. A hero had become a ruler, not by demanding power, but by allowing a desperate nation to hand it to him. With authority consolidated, Messer adopted a new name for his role, one that had no precedent in human governance. He called himself Imperator, a word chosen with intent, a declaration that a new age had begun, the age of centralized command, the age of unified authority, the age of an empire. And on the day he took that title, the world crossed a threshold from which it would not return for more than 2 centuries. Messer had risen, not because he forced the galaxy to kneel, but because the galaxy was already on its knees. He simply reached out and accepted its outstretched hand.
Chapter 4. The Birth of a New Order. December 3rd, 2546.
December 3rd, 2546. A date marked not by war, nor by revolution, nor by the fall of a leader, but by applause. This was the day the United Planets of Earth ceased to exist, and in its place, a new political entity stepped onto the stage of history, the United Empire of Earth. A single word had changed, but the meaning was vast. The moment Messer assumed the title of Imperator, he began reshaping civilization from the ground up. His reforms did not arrive in the roar of tanks or the shadow of warships. They came as signatures, documents and promises. Promises that spoke of unity. Promises that spoke of strength. Promises that echoed through a civilization that wanted to believe in something solid. The most important changes were subtle, and that made them powerful. One of Messer's first actions was a restructuring of authority. Under the new legal framework, military leadership could override civil authorities in the name of security. It was described as a safeguard, a measure to ensure that humanity would never again face a threat unprepared. People accepted it. After all, Messer had earned their trust, but beneath the reassurance lay a quiet shift. Power had begun to flow in one direction, upward. Local governments across human space were reorganized. Governors, councils, and regional authorities were brought under the direct supervision of the imperial administration. The justification was elegant. Unity cannot exist without coordination. And the people, still weary from war, agreed. A fractured system had become streamlined, efficient, centralized. Few questioned what might be lost in the process. Messer understood something many leaders never grasp. Control the story, and you control the future. The Unified History Initiative revised school curricula, reframed historical events, introduced new symbols, new heroes, and a new vision of humanity's destiny. The lesson was simple. We survived because we stood together. We thrive because we obey. We are strong because we are one. It was propaganda, yes, but elegant, invisible, and effective. A generation raised under this vision would never again question the necessity of an empire. The old UPE emblems were quietly retired. In their place rose a new visual language, the imperial eagle, the seal of the imperator, and the tri-Empyrean star. These were not mere designs. They were declarations, declarations that humanity had stepped beyond its past, declarations that humanity had chosen strength, declarations that humanity had become something new, something larger, something unified. December 3rd, 2546, was unlike any other day. There were celebrations, parades, broadcasts filled with triumph and promises of a brighter tomorrow. No uprising, no resistance, no chaos. The empire was born not by force, but by applause. Humanity stood beneath the rising banners of a new age and did not yet see the shadow that unfurled behind them. For every new beginning casts a shadow, and this one would stretch across centuries.
Chapter 5. The Hidden Cost of Glory.
The birth of the empire was celebrated across human space. A new age had dawned, an age of unity, stability, and promise. But every age born in brilliance casts a shadow, and the shadow of the empire was already beginning to take shape. In its earliest years, the empire gleamed with possibility. Trade expanded, new worlds were developed, infrastructure flourished, crime weakened in many regions. To the public, it felt as if humanity had finally found the order it had always longed for. Yet beneath the surface, another truth unfolded, one far quieter and far more dangerous. Tyranny rarely begins with a declaration. It begins with a justification. The empire framed its first restrictive laws as temporary measures, necessary to ensure security, to streamline governance, to protect the future. No one objected. Why would they? After the chaos of the Tevarin War, order felt like a gift. But piece by piece, the freedoms once taken for granted began to weaken. Media channels came under protective oversight. Communications were monitored for security risks. Travel restrictions were introduced quietly, hidden in pages of administrative detail. No arrests, no public threats, just adjustments. Adjustments that tightened the reins one notch at a time. Most citizens didn't notice. Those who did learned quickly that questioning the empire was neither wise nor welcome. The empire did not strike openly at dissent. It didn't need to. Journalists, historians, union leaders, scientists, anyone whose questions grew too loud simply vanished. Official reports explained it as reassignment, temporary detainment, security review. But families knew better. Whispers spread. Fear took root. And fear is the most effective form of control, not because it roars, but because it whispers, because it convinces ordinary people to police themselves. As the empire expanded, its shadow deepened. Citizens went about their lives, rarely noticing the subtle changes that reshaped their world. Schools taught new versions of history. Children recited loyalty oaths before they understood their meaning. Imperial banners hung in every city, blending into the background like part of the landscape. People didn't feel oppressed, they felt protected. Messer had given them what they believed they needed: stability, and stability, once tasted, is hard to question. Over time, the awareness of oppression faded into routine. Routine faded into normalcy. Normalcy hardened into belief. Belief that the empire was not only necessary but right. The empire's influence seeped into every corner of human life. New agencies were formed, new regulations passed, new surveillance systems installed, all of it justified, all of it embraced, and all of it building toward a future dominated not by freedom, but by control, not with violence, not with terror, but with a simple, silent idea that this is just how things are. It is one of the great paradoxes of history. A system built on fear can feel comforting to those who no longer remember anything else. In the decades that came after, the empire grew ever stronger, and with each generation born under its banners, the memory of the UPE, with all its flaws and freedoms, faded into myth. The empire became not a government, but a worldview, a foundation, a reflex, a default, a truth. And in that truth lay the most profound cost of all. The price of glory was not paid with rebellion nor with bloodshed, but with the quiet surrender of autonomy. A surrender so slow, so gentle, that people barely felt it happen. But it happened, and its consequences would echo across centuries.
Chapter 6. The Long Shadow. How the Empire Shaped the Generations that Followed.
The birth of the empire was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of a shadow that would stretch across worlds, across centuries, across the very identity of what it meant to be human. At first, the changes felt small, barely noticeable, the kind of shifts a civilization absorbs without realizing that its foundations are quietly being rearranged. But as years became decades and decades became generations, the truth became undeniable. The empire had not merely ruled humanity, it had shaped it. A generation raised under the empire was a generation raised under certainty. Schools taught single narratives. Heroes were chosen for them. History was simplified, edited, polished into something useful. Children learned not the complexity of the past, but the necessity of unity. They learned that obedience was a virtue, that loyalty was a moral obligation, that questioning was a distraction. A child raised in this world did not grow up wondering whether the empire was right. They grew up wondering how they could best serve it. The genius of the empire's control was that it did not rely on open terror. Fear was present, but it was quiet. It lived in the pauses between conversations, in the glances exchanged when certain topics came up. Most people were not afraid of being punished. They were afraid of attracting attention, so they adjusted. They stayed within lines they did not draw, lines they rarely questioned. Over time, fear stopped feeling like fear. It felt like normal life. The empire did not merely dictate laws. It defined culture. Art celebrated unity. Architecture rose in monumental symmetry. Music echoed themes of duty, strength, and collective purpose. Language itself changed. Words like service, loyalty, and duty took on sacred weight. To be a servant of the empire was not a title of submission, but one of honor. Even in private conversations, people echoed phrases born in imperial broadcast studios. That is how deep the shift went, not just into politics, but into the human mind. As the empire grew, the memory of the UPE faded into obscurity. Children heard of it the way one hears of ancient dynasties, as a clumsy, chaotic relic of a less enlightened age. The freedoms once valued became abstract ideas, barely understood. What was lost could not be mourned because it could no longer be imagined. That was the empire's greatest achievement. It erased the concept of alternatives. Humanity no longer compared systems. Humanity accepted a single truth. This is how things are. When the Messer dynasty finally collapsed in 2792, it seemed for a moment as if the shadow might fade. People rose, truth surfaced, a new government formed. But the empire was not just the Messers. It was the political framework, the administrative structure, the civilian expectations, and the cultural habits that had taken root over nearly 3 centuries. The names at the top changed, the symbols changed, the promises changed, but the architecture of power remained. A new UEE emerged, more democratic, more accountable, more humane, yet still unmistakably shaped by the legacy of its predecessor. The shadow did not disappear. It simply shifted. The long shadow of 2546 extends into every corner of modern human space. It shapes the tension between freedom and order. It influences how the UEE treats its citizens, its military, and its borders. It colors the relationships with other species, the wary patience of the Xi'an, the generational trauma of the Tevarin. It lingers in every political debate, every military deployment, every moment in which humanity asks itself who it is and who it wants to become. The empire may have fallen, but its shadow remains a constant companion in the verse, a reminder that history does not vanish. It echoes, and its echoes shape the future.
Chapter 7. Why this matters: the lore, significance of the Empire's birth.
History is not merely a record of what happened. It is the blueprint for everything that follows. The rise of the empire is not a distant legend or an academic footnote in humanity's past. It is the foundation of the world every player lives in today. To understand the verse, you must understand the moment it was born. The United Empire of Earth is not a structure created in a vacuum. Its institutions, its priorities, its tensions all descend directly from the choices made in 2546. The centralized command, the emphasis on security, the powerful military presence, the sprawling bureaucracy, these are not modern inventions. They are the legacy of Ivar Messer's first reforms. Even with the Messers long gone, the UEE operates within the same architecture of power: streamlined authority, centralized decision-making, a balance between civilian and military influence that always leans just slightly toward the latter. Understanding this is understanding why the UEE behaves as it does today. The First Tevarin War did not end with a treaty. It ended with trauma, a trauma carried by both sides. The Tevarin lost their homeland, their sovereignty, and, eventually, the essence of their cultural identity. Humanity, meanwhile, learned to fear vulnerability. It learned to assume that threats would always come from beyond the borders. This fear became one of the driving forces behind the empire's formation, and it still shapes interspecies relations today. Every Tevarin encounter, every Xi'an negotiation, every alien contact carries the shadow of a war that changed the way humanity views the universe. At the heart of modern human space lies a tension that has never been resolved: the desire for freedom and the desire for stability. The empire promised stability, and for centuries it delivered it at a price. Even now, long after the Messer dynasty fell, that struggle continues. Every debate in the Senate, every advocacy enforcement action, every military deployment drips with the same question: how much freedom are we willing to sacrifice for the sake of security? This question was born in 2546. It lives on in every corner of the modern UEE. No matter who you are in the verse, a citizen, a mercenary, a traitor, a smuggler, a bounty hunter, or a wanderer drifting between the stars, you live inside a world built on the Empire's legacy. The laws that govern you, the threats you face, the faction politics you navigate, the territories you fly through, all of them are shaped by decisions made centuries before your story begins. Your place in the universe exists because of what happened on that single day in 2546. To fly in the verse is to live inside the aftermath of the Empire's birth. History often has dividing lines, moments so monumental that everything before them feels like a different era entirely. For humanity, That line is the birth of the empire. Before it, fragmentation, chaos, uncertainty. After it, order, unity, and power, shadowed by the remnants of authoritarian rule that still linger today. This is why the empire's birth is more than lore. It is context, it is structure, it is identity, and it is the key to understanding everything that follows. History does not sleep. It waits. It waits in old records, in forgotten broadcasts, in the silent corners of time where truth gathers dust until someone is willing to uncover it again. The birth of the empire was not a single moment. It was not forged in one speech, one victory, or one law. It was shaped by fear and hope, by war and exhaustion, by a civilization searching for certainty in a universe that offered none. And in that search, humanity chose a path that would define centuries. The empire rose, the Messers ruled, generations were molded in the shadow of their vision. Worlds changed, cultures shifted, history bent, and long after the dynasty fell, its impact remained, woven into the fabric of the modern UEE. This is the legacy we inherit. This is the truth that shapes the verse. And this archive remembers it. This concludes Episode 1, The Birth of the Empire, Humanity's New Dawn, 2546, from the SCL Archive. Voices of the Verse. The record is sealed, the file is archived, but the story is far from over. We will continue in the next episode.